Hi guys, it's Matt here from MCS-books, and today we're doing our second part of our discussions about the Secrets of Jin-Shei for the MCS read-along. Now in this part of the video we're going to be discussing pages 143 to pages 318, and that's the middle two parts of the book, I guess, which I think, again, you can see as the second act of a play. So in this part you can absolutely see how all the characters sort of come into themselves, and the story is set up with all the most exciting plot points which are perfectly placed to go into the denouement of the final part of the book. Now, if you are watching this and you still haven't read the book, then that's absolutely fine. The first half of this conversation is going to be spoiler-free, and when I give you the warning to say that there are spoilers, you can come out of the video, and the second half of the video will be with some spoilers in. Just like it was last week. Now, thank you to everyone who joined in for the MCS read-along hashtag on Wednesday on Twitter. There were lots of really interesting conversations, and it was lovely to have Alma answering some questions to help develop the conversation in regards to the book and to help us in our understanding of the writing process. Of course, if you are interested, you can still check out the hashtag using MCS read-along on Twitter, and you can see some of the questions that were asked and some of the answers that were given. There were some really insightful answers into the way that Alma wrote the book and the way that she was inspired, and sort of questioning the truth from the research that Alma did, and then the imagination that she used to create the world and the fictional aspects of this book, because of course it is a work of fiction and a work of fantasy, so it was really interesting to hear her thoughts on all those. I have also sent some questions to Alma, and she has filmed some answers for them. So next Saturday, the day before the final video of our read-along goes up, I'll post a video with those answers and that Q&A, so you can see some more thoughts that Alma has about her work process and the way that she put her ideas onto paper and everything. And there are some really interesting answers there which are definitely worth watching, so check back next Saturday. Now, for the purposes of this discussion, the things that we're going to talk about today are the role of men and marriage within this book, and the subsequent power relations that come from that. And then we're going to be talking about dreams and their meaning. Are dreams important within this book? And then finally we'll go into talking about the coming of age within this book, and girls becoming women, taking on their autonomy with a specific interest in certain characters. So I hope you'll be interested in these topics. So let's begin. So part of the Twitter conversation on Wednesday discussed the way that women kind of in this book take hold of their own power, especially in reference to our discussion last week, in which I discussed sort of the role of femininity and womanhood, and the way that some of the characters sort of deny their femininity, especially in regards to marriage. Now in this second part of the book, the topic of marriage becomes more important, specifically as all the characters are becoming within that marriageable age, and especially how some of the characters are put into specific positions in which they have to marry. You'll remember last week we talked about Kylan needing to marry but not wanting to because she wanted to continue education in the men's language, etc, etc. What's interesting about this book, and particularly this part of the book, is the way that marriage then becomes more indicative of class systems and the role that being upper class or lower class has on your need for marriage. So within this book, we have characters from all different sort of classes. We have it from all the way to the top of the emperor's family, and then all the way to the bottom of the daughter of a washerwoman, to even an orphan in the guard, etc. So there's one particular quote that stood out for me in this read, and that was from page 151, in which Liudan and Yurt and Tai are discussing the necessity for Liudan to get married, since she is of marriageable age and needs to choose the emperor for the rest of the country. At this point, Liudan then turns around to Tai and says, sometimes it's a blessing not to be royal. And what I find interesting about that is the way that kind of other classes look at each other. So you have the royal family who are bound by court rules and ways of behaving, and having to sort of get married despite your choices of who you want to marry, because the court have to come up with your suitors and the ones who are suitable for then marrying into the throne. And then you get like the lower class who perhaps have more choice in who they get married to. You know, sometimes there is, of course, they want to marry up, they want their daughters to marry into better families, especially if they want to put their daughters in as concubines into like the royal household, etc. But there is to a level more freedom for these sort of lower class people to marry perhaps for love. That opportunity is something that can happen, as you find out within the book. So it's funny how the two different class relations then kind of look at each other in different ways, and that in some ways, you know, it is imagined to be a better life to be part of the royals or to be part of the upper class, but then in other ways the women are actually suffocated by the lack of freedom and the more rules that are being put on them. So it's interesting when you think about how the women then sort of kind of rebel against these things in different ways. And in this book we have Liu Dan wearing her jacket for court, which Tai made, and was particularly dramatic, since it still abided by the rules of mourning, but at the same time was very definitely sent a strong message. And then you also have Kai Lin, who is also from an upper class family, who has a renowned reputation behind her that kind of stops people from perhaps wanting to marry into her because people know what she's like. The mothers of the sons kind of know what she's like from when she has turned up to certain events and things, and they know that she can be a little bit tricky and not exactly following all the rules. And this role of marriage, but also the way that men play a part of these women's lives, is very interesting when you look at the representation of a new culture that has been introduced in this part. Tamari is from the Travellers clan that live outside of Lin An, the main city that the story takes place in. And because of that, we get a glimpse into a completely different world than we have been used to within this. And there are completely different rules and systems in which the Travellers practice their culture. And because Tamari looks visually different to everyone within this culture, the way that she grew up and the way that the men around her treated her and the way that she chose to involve herself with these other men definitely indicate, again, a different sort of system, and how there are always barriers that put people in place, whether it is through class systems or whether it is through the way that you look or the way that you behave, and that there are very interesting power relations that are at play within this, and the way that the men kind of create power relations to sort of demean the women in ways that, you know, we are used to as understanding within our own society. But then the way that women sort of also gain power, but then also the way that women gain power and make decisions to take back their own autonomy and use their own power. Ian from the Devon Book Club noted how Tai has a very particular power within her group of Jin-Shei, which is also very interesting because she does, you notice, particularly in this part of the book and as it progresses, that Tai, she is almost like a rock in which everyone is drawn towards and is grounded by. Everyone comes to her with their problems and she's the one that is able to give advice and to help bring happiness to all her sisters, which is always very interesting to see how these different power relationships play and work out. And within this book in particular, there are lots of really interesting sort of changes in the way that the power systems are working. So something else that happens within this part, we notice the Shatwao ceremonies, particularly Tai's one, and Tai is the youngest character, so her Shatwao ceremony is the one that finally brings all of the women and all of our characters into the age of being adults. So the Shatwao ceremony is the coming of age ceremony in which the women celebrate their initiation into the world of adulthood. And the ceremony is described absolutely beautifully within this book, and there's a very interesting difference between the way that Liu Dan has her ceremony and the way that Tai has her ceremony. And I find that absolutely fascinating. And what does it mean then within this book to become adults? And how does this particular part of the book also reflect how the characters come into adulthood? It's almost as if this book itself is becoming more adult in that it gets darker as the story progresses and the women become more sure of themselves and the story becomes more sure of itself and its direction really starts to like build up and solidify, which reflects that kind of sense of coming of age, but also coming of something bigger, something scarier perhaps, or even some sort of big change within the characters' lives, but also the life of this story, which I find absolutely fascinating. And with Tai's ceremony in particular, you know, that is probably the biggest representation of how this ceremony or this coming of age allows the characters to become more independent. There's a quote on page 181 that says, "But it seemed that waiting for her daughter to reach this stepping stone to adulthood was the only thing keeping Rimshi alive." And it kind of gives you that sense of importance of becoming an adult, becoming your own person to make your own decisions and to be able to live your life without the need of relying on your parents, which I find really interesting because, again, it goes back to this sense of the role that mothers play within this story and the role that their absence also particularly plays. So I think at the moment that's enough for the non-spoiler section, although it may have sounded like there were spoilers in that part. They're not spoilers, and they won't give away anything that happens, any of the major plot events that happens within this book. So now, let us go into the spoilery section. So the first thing I want to talk about in this section is the meaning of sort of dreams and visions that happen. In this part of the book, we have a very intense journey for Nia in which she explores her relationship with her spirituality and the temple, but then is kind of also besmirched by the relationship of Li Hui. Again, here we get a very interesting power relation and the abuse of power within this part from the things that Li Hui then later does. So when Nia is drawn to Li Hui's home and she's warned away from him the first time, but she finds herself back there again. Then of course we have that very dark scene, which again goes back to the story becoming more adult and the adult themes really coming through here. The way that Li Hui has Nia tied up and completely powerless and then at his mercy, which he has no mercy of course. And the way that he then goes on to rape her and takes a lot more from her, takes that little part of her soul. And I find that really, really interesting when you think about the sort of concept of rape and how at the time Nia, her voice, at the time Li Hui took away Nia's voice, and that feels representative of the powerlessness that women together have when they're put through these sort of situations. And even after, when they are almost voiceless because nobody will listen to them, the police won't believe them, or the male will kind of just silence them and be like, it's what men do. That felt very like important and significant to me when I was reading it, and I really appreciated that sort of broader exploration of what Nia was actually going through, and particularly in regards to her spirituality and the way that her soul was taken. She then goes on to the ghost path to go home, and on that ghost path we see lots of different images, or she sees it and we see it through her eyes. So I've got here on page 231, it says, these are the sort of the images that she catches glimpses of. There's a gathering of laughing people, a funeral, a cup brimming with golden liquid, a sundial in an overgrown garden, a child writhing in flames tied to a wooden stake, 3 naked women dancing on a floor of green glass, a striped cat stalking a sparrow, a yellow sun in an autumn Lin-An sky, an old woman spinning wool with a little girl sitting at her feet and watching with adoring eyes, a solitary wildflower nodding beside an empty road winding off into the distance. Now, I don't want to particularly go through and deconstruct every single image and what it could symbolise, because I think every single person is going to get a different reading of what those things represent. But I do think it's definitely worth you yourself going through that list and kind of thinking, especially if you've read the whole book by now, thinking about what they could represent, whether they represent something that could happen in the future, or whether they represent something that's happened in the past, or whether they are symbols for something greater within Nia's life. And then what could those symbols mean? I think it's absolutely fascinating because they must be important. For at various points, the characters do say that dreams and these sort of visions are important. Because Liu Dan has her dream when she announces herself as Empress, how she's been stood at the top of the mountain, and then she had it 3 nights in a row and it was important. The travellers themselves say over and over again that dreams are important to them. So when Tai discusses the dream that she had that drawn her to get to know Tamari, it is brought up then that dreams are important to the travellers, so they're not going to ignore that. Bearing that in mind, and the importance of dreams and the importance of the visions and the religion of this book, I find it absolutely fascinating to then figure out what these dreams might actually mean, what they represent, and the symbols within them. So it's always something very exciting to look at when you are reading the text, or if you have already done, you can go back to it and try to think about it in context of the whole story. So now I want to talk about a few characters in this section. Tamari is a very interesting character in the way that she is caught between two worlds, that she is almost a weapon that was created but never came to fruition. And I love the way that Tamari is described in this book. You can tell that the way that she is described represents who she is, but also represents the landscape that she is a part of and feels most at home in. On page 260, it says that she sought solitude when she could, growing up wild in the mountains. And there she sort of trained a falcon. She was friends with the animals. She, had fox cubs that were following her around and everything. And it was just absolutely fascinating to see every time that Tamari was described or is described, there is a reflection of the landscape around her and how that kind of represents her role in the world, particularly when she then finds herself in the city and she feels trapped by the walls. She feels like she's in a cage. The falcon that she trained could almost be a representation of herself, in the way that when she's in the city, she feels like a bird within a cage that is no longer free to fly around. And it says it again on page 265. It was as though nature itself had gathered to give vent to her anger and sense of betrayal, but somehow the sight of the burning trees served to calm her furies. And it is fascinating to see that way that nature plays such an important role to Tamari's life and to the symbolism of Tamari as a character. And within this part, you can begin to pick out the threads of the way that she is described in nature and begin to form an opinion of her as a character with depth and greater meaning, and the way that could then pan out in the next part of the book. Now there's also the character of Kai Lin, who I brought up last video as being one of my favourite characters. This is something again that I want to bring up in the next video perhaps, because there's something else that I would like to discuss. But for this part of the video, I want to discuss her choice of marriage. Remember earlier on at the start of the video when I was talking about marriage and the role of men, Kai Lin obviously chose to marry the ninth stage Li Hui, and that is very representative because she was meant to marry a prince that she didn't want to, and she was always kind of dreading that marriage that was being planned for her. But then she took it within her own hands and she made the choice of marrying Li Hui, and of course that choice had its repercussions. So it's interesting to see the way that whenever Kai Lin talks about that marriage and the pain and everything that is inflicted upon her because of it, she will always say that she chose it, that she was the one who wanted it, and that she was only ever given what she was asking for. And I find that sort of absolutely fascinating in the way that she is so pragmatic about the life that she now has to lead because of the choices that she made. And it definitely represents that sort of empirical scientific mind that she has, that she always wants to know how things work and a catalyst that caused things to happen. Rather than finding a spiritual answer to things, she wants the hard facts. And the hard fact is that she was the one who proposed to marry Li Hui, and he just happened to say yes, and he gave her his terms and she agreed. Particularly when at the end of this part she comes back and she says, "I am the alchemist now," which is very interesting as a way to end, particularly when you look at earlier on within this part when Liu Dan announces herself as the Dragon Empress. So there is this tie now between the women. So it represents the way that both these women take their own futures into their own hands, and they sort of, by rejecting a forced choice of marriage and by choosing their own futures, they sort of become these stronger, different people. Liu Dan no longer becomes the third princess, she becomes the Dragon Empress, and Kai Lin is no longer the son of Chile, but she is instead the alchemist and the next sort of mage. So I think that is something to be worth considering. So I think that's something worth considering when you're looking at this part of the book, particularly the way that the women kind of then take their futures into their hands as they become adult, and what that could mean for this final part. What do we expect to happen for this final part of the book? So that's everything I want to say for today. I hope you found this part of the discussion interesting. questions I want to ask for you now are, what do you think is going to happen? What things do you think have been put in place, particularly for an ending to come about? And what sort of ending are you expecting or hoping for? And what are your thoughts about all the things that I've mentioned so far in this video? Do you agree? Do you disagree? Are there things that you want to talk about, or things that you find absolutely interesting that happened within this part? Let me know all this in the comments below. You can always give me a thumbs up if you like this video. And I'll see you next week for 2 videos. The first video, the Q&A with Alan Alexander on Saturday, and on Sunday, the final part of our discussion about the Secrets of Jin-Shei. So I'll see you next time. Bye bye.